A black man walks into a Manhattan skyscraper for a meeting only to be blocked by security and dismissed as a delivery guy. What they didn't know, he wasn't there to drop something off. He was there to take control. 12 floors up, a $15 million deal was about to collapse, and the CEO they tried to keep out was already holding the keys. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move, you challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. They noticed him the moment he stepped through the revolving doors of Silverwell Equity's Manhattan headquarters. Not because he demanded attention. Quite the opposite. He moved with the kind of practiced precision that came from years of knowing exactly how to carry yourself when every room is already assuming you don't belong in it. Julian Cross walked like a man who didn't need permission. His suit was midnight blue, tailored to the sharp lines of his tall frame, his shoes silent against the polished granite floor. In one hand, a leather briefcase, in the other, a phone he wasn't checking as if he didn't need to. His gaze was calm, direct. He knew where he was going. That alone made him suspicious. The receptionist barely looked up. She didn't need to. There was something about the way her eyes slid past him, the deliberate tilt of her head that said, "Not my responsibility." Julian stood in front of the reception desk for a full 10 seconds before she finally acknowledged him with a perfunctory, "May I help you?" He replied with a warm, professional smile. "Yes, good morning. I'm here for a 10:00 a.m. strategy meeting with the acquisitions team. I believe it's on the 49th floor." She blinked. Her fingers paused over the keyboard. Name Julian Cross. Her pause this time was longer. "And who are you with?" He smiled again, just barely. "Silverwell." Now her fingers moved faster, typing something he couldn't see. Then a shift in her posture. Slight, but telling. "I don't have a Julian Cross listed here. Are you sure you're in the right building?" Before he could answer, a man approached from behind. Khaki slack security badge, stiff posture. His tag read, J. Keller. He was mid-40s trim, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Sir, can I help you with something?" Keller asked, stepping between Julian and the reception desk, with an ease that suggested long practice in quietly managing situations. Julian turned politely. "I was just explaining." "Deliveries go around the service entrance," Keller interrupted. "This floor is for corporate appointments." Julian didn't blink. "I'm not making a delivery. I have a meeting on the 49th floor. My name is Julian Cross." There was a long pause. Keller gave him a once-over, the kind that didn't bother hiding the skepticism. Then a smirk. "Right. Well, unless you're on the list, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. I can show you my email confirmation if you'd like." "That won't be necessary," Keller replied, waving a hand dismissively. "If you're meant to be here, someone will come get you." Julian stared at him for a beat longer than was comfortable. Not angry. Just measuring. Then he nodded once and stepped away from the desk, walking toward the long wall of floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Midtown. He stood there, watching the city breathe, ignoring the receptionist's whispers and Keller's lingering stare. 3 minutes later, Bryce Keller was on the phone with someone upstairs. His voice had changed. Gone was the clipped edge. Now it was uncertain taut. Yes, he's still in the lobby. No, I didn't. No one told me he was. Look, I wasn't briefed. He hung up fast. Looked at Julian. Looked away again. Upstairs, the atmosphere was shifting. Quietly, urgently. On the 49th floor, in a glass-walled boardroom overlooking the Hudson, a team of analysts, directors, and senior executives were preparing for what was supposed to be a formality, a brief alignment meeting for the firm's new acquisition project. A $15 million European deal had just been finalized the week before the largest the firm had secured since its near collapse the previous year. No one quite knew who had saved them. Only that someone had stepped in at the 11th hour, injected capital, and now had a seat at the top. Whispers had circulated for weeks. A new CEO was coming, anonymous, appointed directly by the Global Investment Council. Not one of them. Not someone bred in the Silverwell system. Back in the lobby, Julian tapped something on his phone. A secure app. A single thumbprint unlocked a dashboard. He didn't need to use it, but he did. Within seconds, a silent ping reached the head of Global Risk, the COO, and the legal advisor sitting 3 floors above. It wasn't loud. It was powerful. In the time it took the receptionist to finish typing a message to building security, a private elevator opened on the far side of the lobby. Out stepped Leah Sanderson, an analyst in her late 20s, breathless, holding a printed file and looking pale. "Mr. Cross?" she asked. Julian turned. Leah didn't hesitate. "I'm so sorry for the delay. They've been waiting for you upstairs." The receptionist's jaw stiffened. Bryce Keller took a step forward. "Wait, who exactly?" Leah turned on him. Her voice didn't rise, but her eyes did not blink. "This is Julian Cross. He's here to assume his role as acting CEO for global operations, and you've made a serious mistake." The silence that followed was thick and acidic. Keller tried to recover. I wasn't informed. No one said." Julian spoke softly. "You didn't ask." He didn't look back as he followed Leah to the elevator. As the doors closed, Keller remained frozen. The receptionist stared at her monitor, unable to type another word. Upstairs, the room had gone still. Phones buzzed and then stopped. A new name had been added to the internal system. A new face. A profile loaded with credentials no one in the room could match. Julian Cross had arrived, and the meeting wasn't about what they thought it was anymore. It was about what happens when the door you try to block belongs to the man now holding the keys. On the 49th floor of Silverwell Equity's towering headquarters, the air was thinner, not just from the height, but from the pressure. The glass walls surrounding the executive boardroom filtered sunlight like a spotlight, casting long shadows over polished oak tables and gleaming portfolios. Conversations that had once flowed with confident arrogance now came in low murmurs, broken by forced laughter and darting glances. Something had shifted the moment Leah Sanderson had entered with Julian Cross at her side. No one had prepared for him. The assumption had been that the mysterious investor who pulled the firm back from the brink would be another gray-haired mogul, maybe someone semi-retired, a man with cufflinks and a tired smirk. But what stepped off the elevator wasn't that. Julian Cross was young for the role, sharp, black, and silent in a way that made the entire floor recalibrate its sense of control. He didn't storm in with authority. He didn't need to. Authority followed him. It wasn't just the suit or the briefcase. It was how he carried silence like a weapon, calm, deliberate, uncompromising. Inside, the executive wing phones were being set down with more care. HR managers refreshed their inboxes twice. A few directors suddenly remembered meetings they hadn't yet scheduled. Word traveled fast in skyscrapers, but fear moved faster. By the time Julian reached the boardroom, the atmosphere had evolved from discomfort to calculation. Faces that once wore dismissive ease now braced for scrutiny. He didn't speak at first. He simply stood near the head of the table, nodding once to acknowledge the few brave enough to meet his eyes, then sat slowly, deliberately at the spot previously reserved for Silverwell's acting CEO, Michael Brighton. Brighton wasn't in the room. Rumor had it he had stepped out on an unexpected call the moment Julian's identity had been confirmed. The room's oldest member, Arthur Penn, shifted in his chair. He had been with Silverwell since the days when deals were made with handshakes and scotch. Now, he fiddled with his tablet, as if unsure how to turn it on. He cleared his throat, not to speak, but to fill the growing silence. It was Leah Sanderson who broke it first, reading from her notes in a voice steadied by effort. Mr. Cross will be leading the strategic integration of the recent acquisition project, and per directive from the Global Investment Council, will oversee alignment with performance protocols across executive divisions. She looked around, almost apologetic, effective immediately. That final phrase landed like a gavel. The head of global markets. Charles Jung leaned forward slightly, his jaw stiffening. Just for clarity, Leah. This directive came when exactly Julian responded before she could. 3 weeks ago. Jung blinked. 3. Julian's voice was measured, composed. The acquisition funding was only the visible portion. Governance restructuring was part of the agreement. That's standard with high-volume equity interventions. Another executive, a sharp-featured woman named Daria Knox, narrowed her eyes. With respect, Mr. Cross, our teams were not briefed on any operational restructuring. Julian nodded. I know. That's part of the reason I'm here. To see how Silverwell operates when no one knows they're being watched. The silence that followed was not empty. It was judgment rendered. Across the glass partition, a few lower-level employees paused mid-step as they walked by. It wasn't often you saw the top brass sitting this still. From behind the smoked glass door, the image looked like a painting, executives frozen in posture, while a quiet storm sat at their center. Julian flipped open his folder. I won't waste your time. The firm is profitable, but not sustainable. Your internal culture is your greatest liability. Promotions are insular. Reviews lack transparency. Diversity metrics are performative. Leadership engagement scores have declined 9 quarters in a row. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Charles scoffed quietly. And you've gathered all that. From observing the lobby, Julian met his gaze. From observing the silence after I entered it. It was Leah who flinched, remembering how the receptionist wouldn't look up, how Keller had stepped in without question. But it wasn't just them. It was the people watching doing nothing. The ones who'd normalized exclusion behind glass walls. Julian continued, This isn't a lecture. This is notice. Every division head will receive a performance audit based on live data, not last quarter's reports. Anonymous staff feedback, HR filings, project delivery timelines, and documented patterns of bias in team assembly and resource allocation. Arthur Penn gave a weary smile, trying to ease the tone. Mr. Cross, I don't doubt your diligence, but surely you can understand that an outside voice stepping into our operations with such immediacy can create tension. Julian's answer was soft. I'm not stepping in. He looked around the table. I'm stepping up. That phrasing confused them until he added, as of this morning, my role is no longer advisory. I've been appointed acting CEO of Silverwell Equity, confirmed by the Board of Trustees, ratified by the Investment Council, and logged with the SEC. The oxygen seemed to thin. Leah handed out a copy of the signed order dated a full week earlier. Someone on the far end of the table muttered, Jesus. Daria Knox leaned back, visibly rattled. And Brighton? Julian didn't answer. Not directly. Instead, he looked toward the window, where the skyline glittered behind reflection. He'll have the opportunity to respond, but I suspect he already has. The message was clear. Brighton was gone. Whether he stepped aside or was pushed didn't matter now. Julian stood closing the folder. This company has everything it needs to rebuild, but not everyone who built it gets to stay. You'll find that out soon. And with that, he turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind not silence this time, but motion phones pulled from pockets, files opened, whispers ignited. The man in the lobby was now the man above them. And the tower was no longer safe for the people who built it on silence. Julian Cross didn't ask for silence. He simply moved through it, and it made room. On the 50th floor, just above the boardroom, the air was still cold sterile. This was the executive data suite, a level of access known to few, and unlocked by even fewer. Until that day, only 3 people had clearance: Michael Brighton, the former CEO, Leah Sanderson as executive liaison, and Martin Dale, head of compliance. Now, the biometric scanner blinked green as Julian stepped forward alone. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, the room came alive with screens, floating dashboards, legal reports, flagged emails, data visualizations, pulsing with timelines and anomalies. Everything that had gone unseen by the public, unseen by most of the firm's own directors, was here. He scanned the activity logs. It had taken him 12 minutes from lobby to executive suite. In that time, 5 internal chat channels had erupted with coded panic. Phrases like, "Who cleared this?" and "not on today's briefing schedule" littered the archives. Someone from HR had tried to suspend his ID badge, denied by override. Greg Maddox, head of international accounts, had called Leah twice and left 2 voicemails she never answered. And Michael Brighton, had submitted a formal notice to legal transitional leave, pending clarification of executive scope. It was time-stamped 9/9/13 a.m. Julian smiled at the precision. Brighton didn't fight it. He vanished the moment he saw who was holding the briefcase. He tapped a screen, bringing up Silverwell's performance culture survey, one of those corporate gestures everyone ignored. But this one wasn't anonymous to him. It revealed the undercurrent. Dozens of entries from junior staff described a system that rewarded familiarity over competence, image over insight. Words like invisible, dismissed, and passed over repeated again and again. Even his name had appeared once before anyone knew who he really was. Julian Cross. The entry read, "Saw him in the lobby once. Thought he was a vendor." He didn't flinch, just stood tall, like he already knew the ending. He paused on that. It was true. He had known the ending. He just hadn't decided how sharp the fall would be for those who made others feel small. Back down on the 49th floor, the ripple effects had begun. Leah Sanderson stood quietly outside the HR director's glass office as security personnel escorted Teresa front desk reception off the premises. The woman didn't cry. She didn't argue. She didn't even ask for an explanation. She simply gathered her things and walked out with the stunned expression of someone realizing she'd been watched the whole time. I thought he was a delivery guy, she had whispered once to Keller in the lobby. Did you see his suit? That one comment caught by lobby cam audio had traveled further than she could have imagined. In the bullpen, junior staff were whispering with urgency. Some were worried, some excited, a few relieved. Because for every person who clung to the old hierarchy, there were 10 who had been crushed beneath it, praying someone would finally see what they'd endured behind closed conference doors. Back upstairs, Julian brought up the clearance roster. Greg Maddox's credentials were flagged. Daria Knox had 3 pending investigations for discriminatory hiring practices that had been resolved informally 6 months ago. Charles Jung had denied over a dozen mentorship requests from Black and Asian associates, citing fit without documentation. Their sins weren't loud, but they were consistent. Julian tapped into compliance logs and attached summaries to each of their profiles. He didn't need to shout. Truth had its own volume. A soft chime signaled Leah's entrance. "They're restless," she said. "I expected as much," Julian replied. "You know they're going to scramble, try to build alliances, cast doubt on the restructuring." He nodded. "They already are." She hesitated. "Some of them. They're dangerous in quiet ways. They won't come at you directly. They'll try to make you seem like the disruption." Julian looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Then we redefine what stability looks like." Leah exhaled slowly, then walked over to the display nearest the glass. "Do you want me to call a full assembly?" "Not yet." "Then what do we do?" Julian turned back toward the screen, where Brighton's access had already been revoked. "We wait." "For what?" "For the storm to arrive. So I can walk through it standing still." Downstairs in the building cafe, Bryce Keller was on his 3rd coffee and 2nd theory. "I'm telling you," he said to a fellow mid-level manager, "this is a phase play. Brighton's out, but Cross is a placeholder. They'll replace him by Q4. His voice carried just far enough for a nearby analyst, an introverted black woman named Janessa, who had seen Julian twice in 1 week and knew that placeholder wasn't the right word. She didn't interrupt, though. She didn't need to. She'd seen something in Julian's eyes no one at that table had. He wasn't here to play the game. He was here to rewrite the rules, and he had the keys. Greg Maddox had never felt more sure of himself than when he stepped into the executive conference room that morning. His silver cufflinks glinted in the light, and the tailored navy blazer sat on his shoulders like armor. Around the long mahogany table department heads murmured in quiet anticipation, flipping through printed packets that detailed the proposed acquisition of Veritas Analytics. This deal had been 2 quarters in the making. Greg had fought for it, bullied legal sidestepped internal objections, and was now moments away from presenting it as his crowning achievement. He adjusted his lapel, cleared his throat, and began. "Before we dive into projected earnings, let's acknowledge what this acquisition means. Market dominance, data supremacy, a foothold in the Asia-Pacific corridor. This is the deal that moves Silverwell from contender to king." The room nodded politely, but without enthusiasm. Even the most loyal lieutenants looked worn thin by months of rushed approvals and last-minute revisions. One executive, Charles Jung, stared blankly out the window. Others took notes with mechanical disinterest. Still, Greg pushed on, clicking through slides, drawing momentum from the sound of his own voice. That is, until the doors opened. Julian Cross entered with the same unassuming calm he'd carried since that morning. But now there was a difference. He wasn't carrying a briefcase. He wasn't wearing a badge. He wasn't being escorted. He walked like he had always belonged. A few heads turned. Greg's words stumbled, recovered, then faltered again. "Mr. Cross," he said, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "This is a confidential strategic advisory session," Julian finished for him. "I know. I scheduled it." The silence was immediate. A few eyebrows lifted. Daria Knox exchanged a quick look with Jung. Leah Sanderson entered behind Julian and took a seat without a word. That more than anything unsettled the room. Greg straightened. "Then perhaps you'd like to brief the team on your perspective?" Julian nodded. "I'll be brief. The Veritas acquisition won't proceed. A beat. Then two." Laughter escaped Greg, like a nervous tick. "With all due respect," Greg began, "this isn't a theoretical pitch session. This deal is already approved by the M&A team. Legal has signed off, and the funding's been pulled," Julian said calmly. "Effective this morning." That stopped everything. Greg blinked. "Pulled by whom?" Julian didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned toward the projection screen. With a tap on the remote, the PowerPoint vanished. Replacing it was a new slide, one no one in that room had seen before. Silverwell Equity Executive Restructuring Timeline. Phase 2. Below it, in clean lettering, were the names of every person in the room. Alongside each name, a performance metric, a compliance score, a risk factor, and a note. Next to Greg's pending dismissal review, authority breach, cultural risk. Greg went cold. Julian spoke without raising his voice. This acquisition was never the priority. Stability was. And the board, our new board, agreed. What board? Greg snapped. The one chaired by Monica Lee Leah answered, speaking for the first time. As of last week, she assumed full oversight on behalf of international stakeholders. The restructuring authority came with her appointment. Greg turned to Charles, then to Daria, as if someone might object. No one did. Julian stepped forward. "You spent months racing to close a deal for Market Optics, but in doing so, you ignored due diligence flags, bypassed culture audits, and silenced two internal whistleblowers who raised concerns about Veritas's labor practices in South Asia." Daria looked down. She knew it was true. "This isn't a power move," Julian continued. "It's a course correction." Greg laughed again, but it sounded brittle. "Who are you to make that call?" "I'm the new CEO," Julian said evenly. "Effective 2 days ago." The room exhaled. Greg staggered back half a step, his grip tightening on the edge of the table. "No memo," he muttered. "No onboarding. No shareholder announcement." Leah placed a folder in front of him. Inside were signed documents, sealed endorsements, and a formal appointment letter from Silverwell's primary investor group. "It went live this morning," she said. "It just hadn't reached your inbox yet." Greg's eyes moved rapidly across the page. His mouth opened to protest, but there was no ground left to stand on. Julian didn't gloat. He simply folded his hands in front of him and said, "This company's future isn't defined by who speaks the loudest in this room. It's defined by who's still willing to listen." The conference room fell silent again, but this time, the quiet was different. It wasn't stunned. It was sobered. Around the table, people weren't thinking about Veritas anymore. They were thinking about emails they'd ignored, comments they'd made, decisions they'd waved through without question. Julian continued, "I know what it means to be dismissed before you've even spoken. To have the color of your skin judged louder than the credentials in your hand. I won't let this company continue to mirror the world's worst habits Not while I'm here. No one interrupted. He looked directly at Greg. The deal has already closed, but not the one you thought. The deal was always about who gets to define leadership. And that negotiation, that ended the moment I walked through the lobby. Greg sat suddenly small in the leather chair that had once made him feel invincible. Julian turned to the rest of the room. You can stay. You can adapt. You can lead. But you will lead differently. And with that, he walked out. No mic drop. No applause. Just the sound of a man reclaiming what was already his. When Julian Cross stepped back into the elevator after dismantling the illusion of control in that boardroom, he didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel vindicated. What filled his chest was something slower, heavier, a kind of responsibility that extended beyond the titles, beyond the corner office. This wasn't just about exposing Greg Maddox or pulling the brakes on a reckless acquisition. This was about reclaiming a culture that had been quietly bleeding out behind glass walls for years. Word of what had happened traveled fast. Not in loud declarations or press releases, but in the subdued rhythm of internal Slack messages, hushed hallway conversations, and glances exchanged between employees who had long learned to survive by staying quiet. For the first time, the silence inside Silverwell wasn't one of fear, it was one of reckoning. Julian didn't take the executive suite on the 38th floor. Instead, he set up a temporary desk in the open collaborative area 2 floors down, where the product teams worked side by side. He answered his own emails, poured his own coffee, and left his door when there was one open. His first week as CEO wasn't filled with press meetings or brand statements. It was filled with listening. He visited the customer support floor and asked reps what tools they lacked. He sat in on dev sprints with engineers and took handwritten notes. He pulled junior analysts into meetings with VPs, not as tokens, but as voices that mattered. The shift wasn't loud. It wasn't glamorous, but it was unmistakable. What surprised many wasn't how Julian led, but who he chose to bring into leadership with him. Amira Bell, a black data scientist who had spent 3 years under a manager who rarely let her present her own findings, was promoted to head of analytics. She was known for quietly building forecasting models that had saved Silverwell hundreds of thousands but had never once been credited publicly. Julian gave her not just a title, but a platform. Ethan Morales, a soft-spoken veteran in facilities who had quietly kept the building running through budget cuts and underappreciation, was invited to contribute to the new operational sustainability initiative. Julian had noticed him during a conversation about elevator repairs and remembered the way Ethan had spoken about safety, not costs. And Leah Sanderson, who had stood in the eye of the storm with Julian since the moment he walked into the lobby, became his chief of staff. She had known what it meant to navigate power from the margins. Now she would help reshape it from the center. But transformation didn't come without pushback. Some senior staff quietly resigned. A few tried to undermine the process through passive resistance, delaying responses, questioning Julian's methods in hushed tones. But the message became clear when performance evaluations were tied not just to revenue, but to impact, not just to KPIs, but to conduct. Months passed. The office culture began to shift in tangible ways. Anonymous surveys showed dramatic upticks in psychological safety scores. Attrition rates dropped. Cross-department mentorships flourished. The HR department, once seen as a performative arm of risk control, became a trusted space for mediation and development. And the company, despite pausing the Veritas acquisition, exceeded quarterly revenue projections by 12%. It wasn't because of magic. it was because of alignment. Julian didn't change the industry overnight. He didn't seek the spotlight. But his presence rewrote the blueprint for what power could look like. Calm, deliberate, principled. One afternoon, months after the day Greg Maddox was escorted from the building, Julian received a letter handwritten, not printed. It was from Greg. No excuses, no self-pity, just an apology. He wrote about the mirror Julian had held up that day, how it showed him a version of himself that had become too comfortable, too certain. He thanked Julian for not humiliating him, for allowing his exit to be quiet, for giving him room to reflect. Julian folded the letter and placed it in the drawer of his desk, not to forget, but to remember. That change, real change, wasn't about erasure. It was about transformation, even for those who had failed hardest. On the anniversary of the restructuring, Silverwell hosted a town hall not led by executives, but by employees. Emira shared her journey from being talked over in meetings to leading cross-market predictive initiatives. Ethan spoke about how dignity could live even in the logistics of building maintenance. Leah closed the event by talking about courage, not the kind that roars, but the kind that listens. Julian stood at the back, hands in his pockets, letting them take the spotlight. That night, as the lights dimmed over the Manhattan skyline, Julian returned to the same lobby where it had all started. He stood alone near the marble pillar, where he'd once waited, unseen, disregarded. A new security guard stood at the post, now young, attentive, respectful. He greeted Julian with a nod, not because he knew who he was, but because he treated everyone the same. Julian smiled. That was the legacy, not the deals closed, not the titles claimed, but the culture rebuilt one truth, one policy, one person at a time. In the story of Julian Cross, we witnessed far more than a tale of corporate intrigue or a reversal of power. What unfolded was a masterclass in restraint, integrity, and the quiet revolutionary strength of presence. From the moment he stepped into Silverwell Equity's marble lobby, mistaken for anything but what he was, a black man in a tailored suit, daring to exist where others thought he didn't belong, Julian wasn't just fighting for acknowledgement. He was holding a mirror to a culture that had long operated on unspoken codes and unchecked assumptions. What made Julian's story resonate wasn't his title or authority. It was how he wielded both. He didn't raise his voice in retaliation. He didn't retaliate with ego. He watched, he listened, and when it was time, he acted with precision. That moment when the doors to the boardroom opened and Julian walked in, not as a guest, but as the new CEO, was more than cinematic. It was symbolic. It challenged a hierarchy built on invisibility and replaced it with one that demanded visibility, accountability, and truth. But perhaps what mattered most wasn't what Julian dismantled. It was what he built afterward. He could have used his power to punish. Instead, he used it to educate. He gave those who had failed a chance not to erase their wrongs, but to face them and do better. Even Greg Maddox, who had dismissed him, mocked him, and torn up a legally binding contract in arrogance, was not met with vengeance. He was met with standards, with consequence, and eventually with mercy. That balance, firm, but not cruel, became the blueprint for everything Julian did next. He elevated voices that had long been buried under layers of bureaucracy and bias. He made space for people who had never been offered a seat at the table. He shifted the culture not by speech, but by showing up consistently, transparently, and without compromise. The fact that Silverwell Equity not only survived, but thrived under his leadership proves a truth we often overlook. Culture is not a soft asset, it's the foundation of everything. So, what is the real lesson here? It's this: you don't need to scream to be powerful. You don't need to demand respect. You need to embody it. And the greatest impact we can make isn't always in the moment we are wronged, but in how we choose to respond once the power is ours. Julian Cross didn't just rise to the top, he redefined what the top looked like. He proved that dignity and excellence aren't mutually exclusive. That true leadership is measured not by how many people you command, but by how many you uplift. That justice, when rooted in clarity and principle, doesn't need to humiliate to correct. And for anyone who's ever been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed simply for who they are, Julian's journey is proof that you don't have to become loud to be heard. You just have to know your worth and wait for the moment that silence breaks. In today's world, where bias often hides behind professionalism and exclusion, disguises itself as tradition, this story is more than relevant. It's necessary. We are all part of systems in our workplaces, communities, families. And in those systems, we have choices. Will we allow assumptions to speak louder than merit? Or will we use our voice, however small or large, to challenge what no longer serves us? Whether you are someone navigating the margins or someone in a position to open doors for others, the challenge is the same: lead with intention, see people fully, and never forget that humility and power can and should coexist. Thank you for following Julian's story, a story not just about what was revealed, but what was rebuilt. If it made you reflect, if it made you feel seen, if it made you rethink what leadership looks like, then we invite you to stay connected. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge assumptions, elevate unheard voices, and remind us that the most powerful transformations often begin with one quiet act of defiance. What part of Julian's journey moved you the most? Was it the boardroom, reveal the cultural shift, or the redemption that followed? Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your perspective. Together, let's keep telling stories that matter. Stories that don't just entertain, but awaken.